This video is made possible by Practical Defense Systems, the best online security training at the lowest prices. You can start your security career today online at pdsclasses.com. Check them out.
Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. It's time for the GunGuyTV podcast.
Hi, this is Joel Persinger. I'm the Gun Guy. Thank you very much for all of your support of GunGuyTV and everything that you do. I am super grateful for all of your help. This is going to be a little different podcast today because I'm going to change the format of the podcast a little bit. Having been a radio guy and been in broadcasting for a long time, I tend to do any kind of audio show like I would do a radio show where I break it into segments and I put availabilities for commercials in there and that kind of stuff. And that's not really podcasting, I'm learning. And so I tended to do that with the podcast when I first started. And I'm going to stop that because it's a lot of extra work for me and it's probably not as much fun for you. So rather than formatting this thing like a radio show, I'm just going to format it like a conversation. I will put the little bumpers in there periodically just to remind you if you're listening, what the heck you're listening to. And it'll tell you you're listening to the GunGuyTV Firearms podcast or whatever. But other than that, I'm not going to do, I really don't want this to become a commercial enterprise either, I think. So to the degree that you'd like to support GunGuyTV and the podcast, I certainly would appreciate that. And there are a myriad of different ways you can do it. You can do it by using our Amazon link if you want to. I've explained that a million times. You can do it by you can give us a donation. You can go to the GunGuyTV website at GunGuy.tv and you can hit donate. And you can donate a little money or whatever you wish to do. But I'd prefer that it's really an exercise in supporting the Second Amendment and not so much a commercial enterprise. If somebody wants to sponsor the podcast at some point or other, then we'll talk about that at the very beginning. I'll mention them, and then we're going to go on through the podcast. We're not going to talk about it anymore. Right now, Practical Defense Systems is our sponsor, and that's the company I own. So if you're in California and you're interested in security guard training, it is the best security guard training at the lowest prices, and you can do it all online, on demand, on any mobile device. There you go. That's the advertising for Practical Defense Systems for today. Pete Elmore, my friend, and cohort, and co-weirdo, and shooter and like that. Oh, I'm sorry. The last thing I should have mentioned was, in this one, this is audio only if it's public, and that's going to be the case even on Patreon. The first half hour is free. It's available on your favorite podcast player. The next half hour is available only on Patreon. So whenever we get to 30 minutes, whatever we're talking about ends, and we end up with the rest of it over on Patreon. I'm not going to be too structured about it. But if you want to hear the whole thing, you can go to Patreon. The other thing is that as a public podcast, I'm going to leave it audio only because it's just easier to get on your podcast player. We'll put a video version with a thumbnail up on public places like YouTube, BitChute, and so on. But what I'm planning on doing is when we record this, recording it with video and then putting the video version, the full 1 hour version with video on Patreon. So it won't just be audio only on Patreon. I may put two up there, one audio only, one video, and that way you can consume it whichever way you want. All right, having said that, Pete and I were shooting the breeze about a lot of things. I know one of the things we wanted to talk about was great super duper long distance shooting, because I'm not into that and I don't know squat about it, and you do.
Well, I've played around with it for a long time. If you recall, we went out to a range between us and shot out to about 900 yards, just shy of 900.
You shot things at 900 yards. I shot at things.
Hey, you hit it a few times. I
did.
You scored. Come on.
That's
now.
the farthest I've ever shot in my life. I mean, prior to that, I think I told you that day, the farthest I had ever shot anything was maybe 200 yards or something, right around there, 250. I don't remember. Oh, I take it back. I did shoot at a gong one time at 560 yards, and I did clobber it, a couple of times out of 20 shots or something. But it was, luck of the draw, right?
Yeah.
But no, you got me pretty much hitting somewhat consistently out there that day at 900 yards, and I was amazed.
It's a lot of fun. It's you take the shot, and at those distances, it takes the round more than a second to get there, and so you actually see it hit well before you hear it hit, and
Well, you even see you can see the bullet with the trail going through
the vapor trail.
You can see a vapor trail. That's what I was trying to think of. You can see the vapor trail, which is very cool.
Yeah, especially at that distance, it's arcing up quite a ways and then dropping back in on the target. And it's like a good chip shot for a field goal kicker. You watch it go up, and then is it going to make it back down in time?
Well, and reloading is a big deal right now because of the ammunition stuff. A lot of folks are hinting, and some are not hinting. Some are just coming out and saying, it's a conspiracy. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I mean, Remington filed for bankruptcy, and Remington was producing a tremendous amount of ammunition. And, of course, their ammo factory, I believe, was shut down for a period during that time, which took a lot of ammunition out of the public availability. And then people panic buying, which we saw that with toilet paper, for crying out loud. Toilet paper and ammunition, they don't go together, but they can both be panic purchased. And so I think that's largely it. But when you're reloading, how does it differ? Pardon me?
I was going to say, if you think about it, we sold somewhere north of 10 million new firearms last year to first-time buyers. And if every single new buyer went home with just 2 boxes of ammo, that's 20 million boxes of ammo being sold.
Well, that, and you can't buy. So many people freaking out now, getting into reloading because they feel like it's a necessity, not because it's a hobby. For me, it's a hobby, and I enjoy doing it. For you, it's the same thing. But for a lot of folks now, it's, oh my gosh, I'm preparing for the end of the world. Well, there go your primers, which is why you can't find primers anywhere. And there go your, I was talking to Sam Paredes about this. People buy reloading components for guns they don't even have the gun to fire the round. So he said he talked to store owners where people will come in and say, well, I need to buy this and this and this for this caliber for 9mm. Well, I don't have any of that. Well, how about 223? I don't have any of that. Well, what do you got? Well, I've got 6.5 Creedmoor. Well, I don't have a gun for that. Well, that's all I got. Okay, I'll take it. It's like, what are they going to do with it? They're going to load the ammunition. They can't. But they're buying up this stuff that they aren't plan on using, or have no way to consume it. And then I think that's a contributing factor to the lack of stuff.
Well, people think they're going to be able to trade it or barter it. Like there's going to be some town square where people are going to stand around and go, hey, I got 6.5 Creedmoor. I got 2 boxes of 6.5 Creedmoor. Who's got 303 British Enfield, 303 British Enfield? Come on now. There we go on the back.
You're pretty good at that. I've attended a few auctions. I actually bought a couple of cars at auction once, and you're actually pretty good at that. Were you ever an auctioneer by any chance? I
have done some charity auctions, so and had a ton of fun with it. But yeah, that's buy what you can shoot and leave the rest for other people.
Sure. I mean, but the point I brought up with the whole, I was actually going somewhere. I actually had a destination. I didn't get there, but I had a destination. What I was going to mention was the fact that with reloading, just listening to you, because when you and I talk about reloading stuff, you're really the precision reloading guy, where I'm cranking out a bunch of 9mm to go to the range, or a bunch of 40 or something like that, or I'm cranking out a box of 30-06 because I'm going to go knock down a deer with it or something at 250 yards. But you're loading something that you're planning on shooting 1,500 yards, 1,000 yards, and your reloading precision requirements are much, much different than mine as a result. And you've mentioned that before. Yeah. And frankly, truthfully, I don't understand it. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, there are a whole lot of different factors that come into play when it comes into reloading for ULR and ELR, ultra long range and extreme long range shooting. Just to begin with, when you're talking those distances, 800, 900 yards and out, you're talking about significant drop on the round, and velocity, as everybody knows, makes a huge difference in how much drop you're going to have. You'll see 25, 50 feet per second difference between a hot, quote unquote hot, factory round and another round in the exact same box. That makes, when you're shooting out those distances and you're trying to hit a 12-inch target, that's the difference between hitting it and not hitting it. Is that going all the way over and going all the way under. So you'll see most of the guys that shoot long range are looking for a standard deviation of 10 feet per second or less. The guys that are really, really tight are down at 5 feet per second or less, which means that you can go through a box of 20 reloads, and they're going to go, the majority of them are, 95% are going to be between 2850 and 2855 feet per second, whether you're using a Magnus speed or the lab radar or whatever. And they're all going to be consistent.
You're listening to the GunGuyTV podcast.
And then you have guys that, depending on how much OCD you've got, who will take an entire box of bullets and weigh them individually and then group them by their weight. It says it's a 175 grain round or a 300 grain round, but what you'll find is there's some 299.2s and there's some 300.6s and some of these and some of those. And so some guys will actually break those out into groups and group them that way and load them that way. And then you have, in order to get that standard deviation of velocity, you've got to have a charge load that's very, very consistent. So everybody knows about little Trickle Chargers. Well, there's a guy that's got a whole setup, and oh my goodness, is it expensive, but it's amazing to watch. It's got a electronic scale that's hooked up to a computer-ish of sorts that is hooked up to a Trickle Charger everything's all motorized, and it drops a load in, and then it trickle charges, and it's supposed to be within a tenth of a grain.
Oh my god!
A little less. There's and they just keep going up and up and up. That whole setup is well north of $500, and that's not in my price range for just a powder scale. So I'll go with the old beam style in my aging eyes and try and make everything weigh about the same like that. Also factors in there changing the pressure based on how your bullet's seated. If your bullet's seated far back into the cartridge, the volume inside the cartridge is less. And therefore, as the powder starts to burn, you will have a lower amount of volume for that powder to burn in, and therefore you'll have a higher pressure spike. Whereas if it's seated way, way, way out at the end, you have more space, and so the pressure spike may not be as sharp at the front. It may not be as high. And then you've got how far out should the bullet be, and then where the lands start. Where does your chamber end and the barrel begin? Meaning, where's the smooth part stop, and where do the lands begin?
Is that because you don't want to reduce the jump that the bullet has to make from the cartridge to the lands in
that's correct.
In the rifling? That's
correct. And so there are guys that do chamber reaming that they'll adjust where the lands start based on where you tell them that you're going to load your ammo at what overall length, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or you may have a gun that's already set up, and so there are, I think it's Hornaday that makes it, they make a cartridge that fits in. You got to take the bolt out, you slide the cartridge in, and then you twist the dial, and it runs the bullet up, or the fake bullet up, to where it touches the lands, and then you can get the actual measurement of how long it is. And some guys bring it back 5,000, some guys bring it back 9,000, some guys say, well, anything under 10 is okay. Et cetera, et cetera. You want a little gap there, but you don't want a huge gap there. So all of that, every last bit of that affects affects the round as it goes down, because everything is so insanely magnified. If you're looking at just 1,500 yards, if your muzzle or if your barrel is off 0.02 of a degree, that's something like 18 inches at 1,500 yards.
Wow.
And 0.02 of a degree just means that your muzzle has moved about 13 thousandths.
So when I think of precision shooting, I've always thought of the quality build of the rifle itself and all the various parts and pieces and adjustments that go into that, but I never really thought about the ammunition as much. But it sounds to me like everything needs to be accounted for, right down even to the thickness of the brass because right. As you mentioned, pressure changes based upon the volume inside the brass. So if the brass thickness changes dramatically, does that affect your accuracy as well?
Sure, because that's a change in the available, call it the number of cubic millimeters inside the case for a given amount of powder to burn. And guys will, and I do to an extent too, weigh their brass, because you know that the heavier brass has got thicker walls, and therefore you don't have as much space on the inside, given that the outside is exactly the same size.
Does anybody go to the trouble to actually take a micrometer or a caliper or something and measure the thickness of the brass on these things?
I don't know if anybody's doing that. I think the hardest part would be how to do that, because you've got
a very small opening, right?
Yeah.
It's a very small
get down in there. But if you do a full length size, or even use just an X size and rely on the fire form on your brass, that's a whole other discussion. Do you neck size? Do you full length size? Blah 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 blah.
Well, okay. Well, yeah, it is a discussion. Why? Now I do know the difference with that, but if my understanding is that fire forming the brass, that brass is now all you're doing is neck sizing it because you intend to fire that round from the same rifle, and the brass is already fire formed to that chamber. Did I get that right?
That's exactly right. And so there's a lot to be said for neck sizing, so that you're not there's no slop or play, or there's less slop and play between the outside of the brass and the chamber that it's being fired in. So when you think, I think we were talking the other day about bullet seating, and how the dies really work on self-aligning the bullet into the brass.
Yeah, we were talking about the difference between my Lee Loadmaster and what you need in order to do what you have to do, which is a precision level, probably 100 precision levels above what my progressive press is capable of doing.
So there are tools with micrometers on them that will measure. You'll finger turn a bullet around, or an entire round, cartridge and all around, and it'll measure how much deflection the tip has back and forth down into the 0.005 range. And you can see how straight the round is seated, because that's going to affect how it goes into the lands. That's going to affect how it goes down the barrel. That's part of the reason why you want a little bit of jump, is to try and correct anything that might be off there. That's going to affect the aerodynamics once you get out of the barrel. So you talk about, just to clarify, when you talk about ballistics, there's three areas of ballistics that you'll talk about. There's internal ballistics, external ballistics, and terminal ballistics. To work backwards, terminal ballistics is what happens when the round hits whatever it's supposed to be hitting. Not so much a big deal in target shooting, but if you are taking if you're taking game at some distance, 200 yards, 400 yards, terminal ballistics is how well does it mushroom, how well does it hold together? How well does it penetrate? That's terminal ballistics.
Shooting straight and always right on target. This is the GunGuyTV podcast.
Well, and before you go any further, I mean, some people will, particularly if you're a new shooter and you're not a hunter and you're just not a hunter, and you listen to that and you think, well, that's just really horrible. Well, actually, no, it's not. Terminal ballistics are very important because if you are hunting a moose, like my friend Bart up in Alaska or something, or you're hunting some big game animal, you want to kill that animal humanely. Yes. You want the animal to go down right there or very close to right there. You don't want to wound the animal and have the animal go for, a time in agonizing pain and, for 200, 300, 400 yards or a quarter of a mile or something along those lines. So that terminal ballistics is super important when you're looking at, from the standpoint of hunting. And it's very important for hunters, not from the standpoint of being cruel, but precisely the opposite. The idea is to take the game in a humane fashion, and so terminal ballistics are very important in order to do that.
That's correct. That's great. Exactly right. And then external ballistics is what happens when the bullet is out of the barrel and on its way to the target, and that has everything to do with air density, temperature, pressure, altitude, you name it, all of those factors come into play. And then internal ballistics, or the start of the shot, is everything that happens inside the gun. So when the primer goes off and the pressure starts to spike inside the case from the primer going off, does the round unseat itself and move forward up to the lands or not? When the powder goes off, how much room is there? What's the pressure spike? What does the pressure gradient look like from the beginning of the burn to the round exiting the muzzle? Then you have all of the harmonics that go in place. One of the things that fascinates me about this field is the physics, just the plain physics involved. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So as the bullet goes down the barrel and the barrel is forcing the twist onto the bullet is trying to untwist the barrel at the same time, which is why you typically see target barrels being thicker and heavier than a hunting barrel, because they'll heat up because you're shooting over and over and over again, and you need some way to absorb that energy, but you don't want them to whip or twist to any more than you can prevent it. When you were talking about the precision of how the rifle's made, the stiffness with which it's made. Is there any flex anywhere? The whole rifle is like a tuning fork, and there's going to be certain frequencies that will resonate within the gun, and you'll get, barrel movement of, X thousandths of an inch or X fractions of a thousandth of an inch at the barrel as the round goes down the barrel. I mean, you're thinking you've got 40, 50,000 PSI behind that round. Yeah, the barrel's pretty thick. Yeah, it's some pretty tough metal. But at the same time, 50,000 PSI is going to have an effect on that steel. And it's going to cause some limited amount of flex. And all of that combined, and then how rigid is the chassis and how is it anchored? At 1,000 yards, if perfectly calm wind, you're going to see a difference in your point of impact if you shoot off a sandbag and then you turn around and shoot off your tripod, because that changes the harmonics of the firearm. You're going to get some sliding movement off the sandbag. You're going to get some resonance off the tripod, and that will make a difference in where the round impacts.
And when I think of ultra long range shooting, personally, when I think of it, my indoctrination into that, I guess, or just in my indoctrination to the awareness of it, was watching competitions, watching them do it in competition. Whereas I suspect that the average person's indoctrination into the knowledge of that is watching movies or whatever, when you've got the special ops sniper shooting at some phenomenal distance. Yeah. Where I didn't, really, when you talk about ultra long range shooting as a result, the first thing that pops into my head is the competitions that I've watched. And I was never in the military, so I don't have the military experience to lean back on. But having watched those competitions, you mentioned it, calm wind, or windy, temperature, all of those things come into play, and humidity and elevation and all that stuff sort of comes into play too, doesn't it?
Yeah, every last bit of it. When you look at all of the factors that go into making a shot, I mean, start with the ammo temperature. The powder will burn at a different rate at 40 degrees than it will at 80 degrees.
Are you talking about the temperature of the actual cartridge, the actual ammo?
Yeah.
Not the temperature that it reaches when it burns, but the starting temperature when you take it out of the box and you put it in the magazine of the rifle, the temperature of that particular round.
I have for extremes, when it's a normal day, I don't mess with it. Excuse me, but I have in my bag for extremes an infrared thermometer, and I'll take a look and I'll shoot I'll take a temperature on the case to see where it's at when it's really, if I'm doing something in the wintertime out in Colorado and it's ultra long range, I'll take a look at where the ammo temperature is. I've been to competitions where it's really cold and guys will take their ammo and stick it under their shirt into their armpit to warm it up to a normal temperature so that they have the charts and the data and can get the consistency that they expect from the round going off. Because there will be, you put a 40-degree round in the barrel and you put a 80-degree round in the barrel, and those two, the velocities at the end of the barrel will be drastically different between the two. It's really about the powder temperature. And so you will, when it's really, really cold, because I get so few chances to go out when it's really cold, I like to go to some place like the range we went to before and let the ammo get really cold, because I don't get a lot of data on that. And if I can find out that for every 10 degrees Fahrenheit difference in my ammo, I'm going to see, or just say 10 feet per second difference in my velocity, then I can extrapolate that at 30 degrees, another 10 degrees colder or 20 degrees colder than the 50 down at the range, I'm probably going to see, 20, 28, 20 feet per second out of the barrel. And I can make those adjustments, and I can take a look at an additional drop because I'm not going to have the velocity that I would have. Conversely, we go out there in the summertime and it's 95 or 100 degrees. We're getting velocities that we'll never see in the wintertime. And so I'm not going to get the drop that I would expect at 1,000 or 1,200 yards.
This really doesn't, for the new shooter or the new hunter, there's a lot of new shooters out there. I should probably clarify, and please, Pete, like I started out the podcast saying about it, I don't know anything about this, okay? So if I get this wrong, then please correct me. But this really doesn't come into play when you're firing your handgun at the range or you're taking your handgun out and it doesn't come into play when you're hunting with your rifle and your shot's going to be 150 yards or 75 yards or even 200 yards, really. I mean, you're talking about distances that far exceed that.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the beauties of sighting in your rifle at 100 yards. Even though I'm planning on shooting plus or minus 900,000 yards, I'm still sighted in at 100 yards. And the reason for that is, at 100 yards, wind is really not going to have a huge effect, especially when I'm coming out of the barrel at close to 3,000 feet per second with a 300 grain Sierra Match King. Again, it's angles and a small change in angles when you are at 100 yards doesn't make much of a difference.
The precision is not as important at those shorter distances.
Yeah, when I take my favorite hunting rifle out, I will adjust the scope. I'll step it up to where it's on center at 200 yards, and I know that will, if I take the shot correctly, I'm going to be plus or minus an inch and a half from the muzzle all the way out to 350, almost 400 yards. So I don't have to make any corrections. If it's getting out to 400, I may hold an inch or two high, but that's it. That's the only correction that I'm going to have to make. And so, that's a one set it and forget it. You don't have to, if you have a quick shot you got to take, because he just happened to stop there and look around and turn his head in your direction, then you take it. And you know that your accuracy, what is it to the one of the U type? You're at 1 minute of animal right there.
That's it. Yeah.
You know that round's going to go right through the engine room, right where you want it to, and drop them humanely and quickly.
Well, Pete and I are going to talk more about this subject because it's a very deep and encouraging and I think very interesting subject to talk about with long-range shooting. But unfortunately, we've run out of time for the public version of the podcast, so the rest of it's going to be on Patreon. So if you're on Patreon, I want you to stick with me. If you're not on Patreon, I urge you to support us on Patreon. That's where you're going to get all the exclusive content, like the remainder of this podcast, for one thing, that you can't get anywhere else. If you're on the public podcast player and you're not part of Patreon, I want to thank you very much for all of your support. And wherever you go, whatever you do, stay safe.
You've been listening to the GunGuy TV podcast.